A highly trained Special Forces operator disguises himself as a homeless man to escape his past. But when a street gang threatens his new life, a shocking revelation about the night his team died forces him to confront the deadly conspiracy he's been running from. The streetlight flickered ominously as 5 young men emerged from the shadows, their tattered clothes and visible tattoos marking them as members of the local gang. Their laughter echoed through the empty street as they approached a lone figure huddled against a brick wall. The homeless man, wrapped in a worn military jacket, remained motionless, seemingly unaware of the impending threat. "Hey, old-timer," the gang leader sneered, his gold tooth glinting in the dim light. "Looks like you picked the wrong alley to call home tonight." His companions snickered, forming a loose circle around their intended victim. None of them noticed the subtle shift in the homeless man's posture, nor the calculating coldness that flashed across his eyes. The leader stepped forward, cracking his knuckles with theatrical menace. "Time to teach you about territory, old man." He reached down to grab the seemingly helpless figure, completely oblivious to the grave mistake he was about to make. What the gang couldn't know, was that the disheveled man before them was far from helpless. Beneath the layers of dirt and worn clothing lay the hardened muscles and razor-sharp instincts of an elite soldier. Former Staff Sergeant James Morrison had spent 15 years in special operations, conducting missions that would never appear in any official record. 3 years ago, a catastrophic operation in Eastern Europe had left his entire team dead, victims of a carefully orchestrated ambush. The weight of that failure, the faces of his fallen brothers in arms, had driven Morrison away from his former life. He'd chosen anonymity among society's forgotten, trading his tactical gear for ragged clothes, his military quarters for cardboard boxes and alleyways. Now, as the gang closed in around him, Morrison remained still, his breathing steady and controlled. He'd spent months avoiding confrontation, blending into the invisible masses of the city's homeless population. But sometimes, as he was about to demonstrate, the past has a way of catching up. And tonight, these young predators were about to learn why some prey is best left alone. Have you ever witnessed a story where appearances proved dangerously deceiving? Subscribe and join us as we uncover the gripping tale of a man who learned that running from your past doesn't mean it stops following you. The cold concrete pressed against Morrison's back as the gang members advanced, triggering memories he'd fought hard to suppress. His mind flashed back to his first day of special operations training 15 years earlier. The drill sergeant's words still echoed in his ears. "Your greatest weapon isn't your gun. It's your ability to become invisible until the moment you choose not to be." Through the grimy lens of his current reality, those memories played like scenes from someone else's life. Morrison had been different then. Clean-shaven, straight-backed, with eyes that burned with purpose. He'd graduated top of his class in advanced combat tactics, earning his place in an elite unit that officially didn't exist. The missions blurred together in his memory. Midnight insertions into hostile territory, precision strikes that changed the course of conflicts without leaving a trace, extractions that seemed impossible until his team made them look easy. His team, his team. The weight of their dog tags still pressed against his chest, hidden beneath layers of dirt-stained clothes. He remembered them all. Garcia, the communications specialist who could hack any system while cracking jokes in 3 languages. Chen, their medic, whose steady hands had pulled Morrison back from the brink more times than he cared to count. Williams, the youngest, always carrying that worn photo of his newborn daughter. And Jackson, his second-in-command, who'd been by his side for a decade of impossible missions. The memories of that final operation in Kosovo crashed through his mental defenses. Intelligence had promised a routine extraction, a high-value target who needed to disappear. They'd done dozens of similar missions, but this one was different. Someone had been waiting for them. The first explosion had taken out their communications. The second had separated the team. In the chaos that followed, Morrison had heard their deaths through his tactical radio, one by one. Garcia's last transmission cut mid-sentence. Chen's final words were a calm recitation of his own injuries. Williams had called out for his daughter. Jackson had died trying to reach him. Morrison had survived, barely. 3 days later, he'd woken up in a military hospital in Germany, his body broken but healing. The official report cited equipment malfunction and unavoidable casualties. But Morrison knew better. They'd been set up, betrayed by someone high enough to know their protocols, someone who'd wanted them silenced. The investigation went nowhere. The higher-ups offered him a desk job, a chance to continue serving. But Morrison couldn't stomach it. The sight of his uniform made him sick. The medals they tried to pin on his chest felt like bullets. So one night, he simply walked away. He chose the streets because they offered what he craved most: anonymity. Among the homeless, no one asked questions about your past. No one looked too closely at the scars, physical or otherwise. He became just another shadow in the urban landscape, another forgotten face in the crowd. For 3 years, he'd maintained this existence, moving between shelters and alleyways, taking odd jobs when he needed to, helping other street dwellers in quiet ways that wouldn't draw attention. He'd gotten good at being invisible, at suppressing the instincts that still hummed beneath his skin. But now, as the gang members moved closer, those instincts were awakening. His muscles remembered their training, even as his mind fought against it. He could read their movements, see their weaknesses, calculate a dozen ways to end this confrontation before it began. Morrison's fingers twitched slightly, muscle memory reaching for weapons that were no longer there. He forced them still. He'd chosen this life of invisibility for a reason. But as the gang leader's shadow fell across him, Morrison wondered if perhaps some choices weren't really choices at all. The alley where Morrison sat was just one dark vein in a city's diseased heart. 10th Street, the locals called it. Though the official street sign had long since disappeared, probably sold for scrap like everything else of value in this neighborhood. The surrounding buildings loomed like decaying giants, their windows either boarded up or broken, their walls canvas for gang tags and desperate graffiti. During the day, this part of the city maintained a thin veneer of legitimacy. The pawn shop on the corner still opened its doors, though everyone knew it was a front for something darker. The convenience store across the street sold more items under the counter than on its dusty shelves. But at night, the pretense dropped away, leaving only the raw truth of urban decay. Morrison had chosen this territory carefully. It sat on the border between two rival gang territories, a no-man's land where even the most hardened criminals tread carefully. The homeless community here was small but tight-knit, invisible to most but always watching, always aware. They had their own hierarchy, their own rules. Old Pete occupied the cardboard box beneath the fire escape, his Vietnam-era dog tags marking him as something of an elder statesman among the street dwellers. Maria, a former nurse who'd lost everything to opioids, kept a makeshift clinic behind the dumpster of Wong's Chinese restaurant. She traded basic medical care for whatever people could offer: food, blankets, information. Morrison had earned his place in the Shadows Society through small acts of protection. He never spoke about his past, but his actions revealed enough. When two crack addicts tried to rob old Pete, Morrison had appeared silently from the darkness, disarming them with mechanical efficiency. When Maria needed supplies for her clinic, mysterious packages would appear outside her makeshift door. The other homeless residents gave him space, respect, but not fear. They'd seen him share his meager food with the newly homeless teenagers who sometimes appeared, lost and scared. They'd watched him teach survival skills to those willing to learn, how to find warm air vents in winter, which shelters were safe, which to avoid. Wong, the restaurant owner, was one of the few who bridged both worlds. Every night at closing, he'd leave bags of leftover food by his back door. Not as garbage, they were carefully packed, still warm. He never acknowledged the shadows that collected these offerings, but his security cameras mysteriously stopped working during these times. The city's official response to its homeless population alternated between neglect and harassment. Police sweeps would come through periodically, destroying camps and confiscating possessions under the guise of urban beautification. Social workers appeared occasionally, armed with clipboards and good intentions, but their shelters were always full, their programs underfunded. Tonight's gang activity was unusual for this particular spot. Morrison had watched the neighborhood's power dynamics shift over the past few weeks. The Blue Street crew, the gang currently surrounding him, had been pushing their boundaries, testing limits. Their leader, a young man who called himself King, was new to power and eager to prove himself. From his position against the wall, Morrison could see the wider context of the confrontation. 3 blocks east, the neon signs of downtown painted the sky in artificial colors. To the west, the industrial district's abandoned factories stood like skeletal monuments to better times. Somewhere in between, everyday people lived their lives, blind to the parallel world that existed in the shadows of their city. The temperature had dropped with the sun, and the first hints of frost crystallized on the edges of puddles. Winter was coming, which always changed the dynamics of street life. The homeless population would thin as some sought shelter in overcrowded facilities or migrated south. Those who remained would face not just violence and hunger, but the very real threat of freezing to death. Morrison had survived 2 winters on these streets already. He'd learned to layer newspapers under his clothes, to find the steam grates that stayed warm through the night. He'd helped others do the same, though some hadn't made it despite his efforts. Their faces joined the others in his memory, a different kind of casualty list. A police siren wailed in the distance, and for a moment, the gang members tensed. But the sound faded, moving away, and their attention returned to their intended victim. They didn't notice how Morrison had used that momentary distraction to shift his position slightly, giving himself better leverage against the wall. They didn't see how his eyes had mapped every escape route, every potential weapon within reach. The city held its breath, another night of violence about to unfold in its endless cycle. But this time, something was different. This time, the prey they'd chosen was anything but helpless. The gang members wore blue bandanas, the signature of the Blue Street crew. But their nervous energy betrayed their inexperience. All except their leader, King, whose gold tooth glinted as he pulled out a switchblade. Morrison recognized the look in his eyes, the dangerous cocktail of ambition and insecurity that made young men particularly lethal. "You know what we do to trespassers, old man?" King twirled the blade between his fingers with practiced ease. His reputation in the neighborhood had been built on public displays of violence. 3 weeks ago, he'd beaten a shopkeeper into a coma for refusing to pay protection money. Last week, a rival gang member had disappeared after challenging his authority. The other 4 spread out in a practice formation. 2 carried baseball bats, 1 had brass knuckles, and the youngest, barely 17, clutched a length of chain. They'd done this before, but usually against easier targets. Drunk college students, lost tourists, other homeless people too weak or old to fight back. "This is Blue Street territory now," King announced, his voice carrying the artificial swagger of someone playing a role they hadn't quite grown into. "And we got a cleaning fee for anyone sleeping on our turf." Morrison remained silent, his stillness unnatural enough to cause the youngest gang member to shift uncomfortably. The kid's chain clinked softly, betraying his nervousness. Morrison noted how he stayed slightly behind the others, his stance more defensive than aggressive. "You deaf, old man?" King stepped closer, his boots scraping against the concrete. The smell of cheap cologne and marijuana clung to him. "Maybe we need to check if you can still hear." He made a quick slashing motion with his blade, close enough to Morrison's face to stir the air, but not actually making contact. It was an intimidation tactic, one designed to provoke fear, or at least a flinch. Morrison didn't move. His eyes, however, tracked the blade's path with mechanical precision, calculating speed, reach, and the slight favoring of King's left side. An old injury, perhaps, or poor training. The gang leader's face darkened at the lack of response. Fear he understood, defiance he expected, but this emptiness, this complete absence of reaction, unsettled him in ways he couldn't articulate. "Hold him!" he barked at his followers, taking a step back. 2 of them moved forward, bats raised. The third cracked his knuckles, brass glinting. The youngest hung back, his chain now dangling uselessly at his side. None of them noticed how Morrison's breathing had changed, becoming deeper, more measured, the breathing pattern of a combat veteran preparing for engagement. "We're going to teach you about respect," King announced, playing to his audience. "Gonna make an example that'll help other folks remember whose streets these are." Morrison could smell their fear now, mixed with adrenaline and cheap beer. They were dangerous in the way that all cornered animals are dangerous, but they lacked discipline, training. Their formation had holes. Their weight distribution telegraphed their intended moves. They were predators, yes, but they'd never faced anything like him. The first bat wielder was already shifting his weight to his front foot, preparing to swing. The one with brass knuckles had his guard too high, leaving his midsection exposed. The second bat would come from the left, trying to pin Morrison against the wall. Amateur mistakes, all of them. King raised his blade again, this time with purpose rather than show. Last chance, old-timer. Empty your pockets, kiss my boots, and maybe we only hurt you a little. The gang's reputation had spread through the neighborhood like a virus. They'd started small, vandalism, petty theft, but had quickly escalated to more violent crimes. The police seemed unable or unwilling to stop them. Other gangs gave them space, waiting to see how far they go. Morrison knew their type. He'd seen them in every war zone he'd operated in, young men drunk on their first taste of power, mistaking cruelty for strength. They'd chosen him because he appeared weak, because his silence seemed like submission. They had no way of knowing they'd just made the worst mistake of their lives. The air grew thick with tension as King raised his hand, preparing to give the signal for attack. In that frozen moment, Morrison made his decision. He tried to leave violence behind, to bury his old life under layers of anonymity. But sometimes the past doesn't give you a choice about when it resurfaces. The first attack came exactly as Morrison had anticipated. The bat whistled through the air where his head had been a split second earlier, striking the brick wall with a dull thud. Before the attacker could recover, Morrison had already shifted his weight, appearing to stumble, but actually positioning himself for what would come next. "Stop playing around," King barked, his confidence wavering slightly at Morrison's unexpected agility. "Pin him down." Over the past few weeks, similar scenes had played out across the neighborhood. The Blue Street crew had been testing boundaries, pushing further into disputed territory. Morrison had watched them from the shadows, noting their patterns, their escalating violence. He'd seen them harass the Korean couple who ran the corner store, had witnessed their confrontations with rival gangs. Each incident had been more brutal than the last. 3 days ago, they'd cornered a homeless veteran near the abandoned factory. Old Pete had found him the next morning, beaten so badly he could barely speak. Maria had done what she could, but the man's injuries required real medical attention. Attention he'd never receive. The second bat swung low, aiming for Morrison's knees. He allowed it to graze his pants, letting them think they were hurting him. In reality, he was calculating distances, timing their movements. The gang members were growing frustrated with his elusive behavior, their attacks becoming more aggressive, but less coordinated. "What's wrong with this guy?" muttered one of the bat wielders, sweat beginning to show through his blue bandana despite the cold night air. "He ain't fighting back, but we can't—" "Shut up and hit him," King interrupted. But there was an edge of uncertainty in his voice now. Something about their target's movements felt wrong, practiced, deliberate. Morrison had maintained this careful dance for weeks now, avoiding direct confrontation while staying aware of the growing threat. He changed his sleeping spots regularly, kept to the shadows, tried to warn others when he could. But the gang's territory had expanded like an oil spill, toxic and inexorable, until this moment became inevitable. The one with brass knuckles lunged forward, telegraphing his punch from a mile away. Morrison swayed just enough to make it look like a lucky dodge. The attacker's momentum carried him forward, causing him to stumble slightly. Nobody noticed how Morrison had subtly guided this movement, positioning the gang member as an obstacle for his own companions. "Stop moving!" King's voice cracked slightly, his carefully constructed authority beginning to show cracks. He slashed with his knife again, but the movement was wilder now, less controlled. The youngest gang member had backed away further, his chain hanging forgotten at his side. His eyes darted between Morrison and his fellow gang members, seeing what they couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge. They weren't in control of this situation. They never had been. The tension in the alley had shifted imperceptibly. What had started as a simple show of force, a routine intimidation, had evolved into something else. The gang members felt it in their gut, that primal instinct that warns prey when they've accidentally cornered something far more dangerous than themselves. Morrison could have ended it already. Every wild swing, every telegraphed punch presented opportunities for devastating counters. But he maintained his passive defense, letting them tire themselves out, letting their frustration build. He'd seen their type before, young predators who'd never learned what it meant to be truly afraid. "This ends now," King shouted, trying to reassert control over a situation that was rapidly slipping away. He nodded to his companions, initiating a coordinated attack they'd used successfully many times before. But as they moved to surround Morrison completely, as King raised his knife for what he intended to be a decisive strike, something changed in the homeless man's demeanor. His shoulders straightened almost imperceptibly. His feet shifted into a stance that would have been familiar to any combat instructor. His eyes, which had seemed vacant and unfocused, suddenly sharpened with predatory intensity. The gang members felt the change before they saw it. That instinctive part of their brains, the part that evolved to recognize danger, screamed at them to run. But pride and peer pressure kept them in place, committed to a course of action that was about to teach them a brutal lesson about appearances and reality. The youngest gang member, Marcus, felt his chain grow heavy in his hands as he watched the scene unfold. Something about the homeless man's transformation triggered a memory. His uncle, a former Marine, shifting stance during a family barbecue when a drunk neighbor had become aggressive. That same coiled tension, that same controlled precision. From his position at the back of the group, Marcus noticed details his fellow gang members missed. The way the homeless man's feet had settled into a balanced stance. How his hands, though seemingly relaxed, were positioned to strike or defend. Most tellingly, how his eyes tracked multiple targets simultaneously. Something Marcus had only seen in trained fighters. "What are you waiting for?" King's voice cut through the tension. "Get in there!" Marcus hesitated, his chain hanging limp. He joined the Blue Street crew 6 months ago, seeking protection after his mother's death left him vulnerable to the neighborhood's harsh realities. The gang had offered structure, brotherhood, purpose, or so he'd thought. Lately, though, under King's leadership, something had changed. The violence had become less about survival and more about cruelty. A figure moved in Marcus's peripheral vision. Across the street, partially hidden in a doorway, stood Mr. Chen, the retired cop who ran the local community center. The old man's presence was unexpected. He usually avoided the streets after dark. But there he was, watching intently, his hand resting near his hip where Marcus knew he still carried his licensed weapon. The homeless man's eyes flickered briefly to Mr. Chen, then back to his immediate threats, acknowledging the observer without losing focus on the danger at hand. That split-second exchange spoke volumes to Marcus. These two men recognized something in each other, some shared understanding of violence and duty. "Marcus!" King's sharp command snapped him back to the immediate situation. "Stop standing there like a little bitch and help us take this fool down." But Marcus remained rooted in place, watching as his fellow gang members circled their target. He'd seen King's version of taking someone down before. Last week it had been a 16-year-old kid who'd allegedly disrespected him. The boy was still in the hospital. The homeless man's gaze met Marcus's briefly. There was no plea for mercy in those eyes, no fear, only a quiet assessment and, surprisingly, what's he realized, but for the young gang member's situation. Mr. Chen had taken a single step forward from his doorway, his experienced eyes reading the situation. Marcus knew the former officer's reputation. 25 years on the force, most of it working gang units. He'd retired after taking a bullet breaking up a drug deal, but he hadn't given up on the neighborhood. His community center offered a safe haven for kids looking to escape gang life. The air in the alley grew thick with anticipation. Marcus felt sweat trickle down his spine despite the cold. His fellow gang members were positioning themselves for their coordinated attack, but their movement seemed clumsy compared to their target's controlled stillness. "Last chance," King announced, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Take him!" In that moment, Marcus made a decision. His chain clattered to the ground, the sound echoing off the alley walls. 5 pairs of eyes turned to him, 4 filled with surprise and anger, 1 with quiet approval. "Pick that up!" King snarled, but Marcus was already backing away. "No," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't right." The homeless man's expression hadn't changed, but something in his posture shifted subtly, adjusting to protect Marcus's position, even as he maintained his defense against the others. Across the street, Mr. Chen had moved fully into the light, his presence now obvious to everyone. His hand remained near his hip, his stance casual but ready. a silent guardian offering another path, another choice. Marcus took another step back, then another. He felt the weight of multiple loyalties pulling at him, to his gang, to his conscience, to the possibility of a different future. Behind him, he heard King curse, but the sound seemed distant, less important than the decision he was making. The tension in the alley reached its breaking point. Something was about to give, and Marcus had just chosen which side of the coming storm he would stand on. Morrison processed the shifting dynamics with tactical precision. The young gang member's defection had created a momentary distraction, one he could exploit immediately for a decisive victory. But experience had taught him that quick wins often lead to prolonged conflicts. This situation required a more strategic approach. Through the corner of his eye, he noted Mr. Chen's position, recognizing the retired officer's tactical awareness in his chosen vantage point. The man had positioned himself to cover both the alley's entrance and the street beyond, creating a natural escape route for the young defector, while simultaneously establishing a clear line of sight on the remaining gang members. King's attention was split now, divided between his intended victim and his crumbling authority. His knife hand had started to tremble slightly, not from fear, but from rage. Morrison had seen that look before, in warlords and terrorists when their control began to slip. It made them predictable. "Marcus, you walk away now. You're dead," King spat, trying to reassert control. "You hear me? Dead." Morrison used these precious seconds to implement his plan. He'd spent weeks memorizing this alley's layout. The loose bricks in the wall behind him, the partially broken fire escape above, the uneven spacing of the dumpsters. Each element could serve multiple purposes: weapons, obstacles, or escape routes. The remaining gang members had unconsciously tightened their formation, compensating for their lost member. This created new blind spots in their coverage. Morrison shifted his weight imperceptibly, positioning himself to exploit these gaps. He needed to end this confrontation decisively, but without causing permanent damage. Dead or seriously injured gang members would only escalate the cycle of violence. His military training had emphasized the importance of psychological warfare. Physical dominance was temporary. Fear lasted longer, but respect could change behavior permanently. These young men needed to learn a lesson they wouldn't forget, but one that wouldn't drive them toward greater violence in response. Morrison had already identified each attacker's weaknesses. The one with brass knuckles telegraphed his moves through his shoulders. The bat-wielders both favored their right sides, creating predictable attack patterns. King, despite his bravado, had never faced serious resistance. His knife work was all show, no substance. The fire escape above them creaked in the wind, drawing quick glances from the gang members. Morrison logged their reactions. They were getting jumpy, their adrenaline spiking. Soon they would attack out of nervous energy alone, their coordinated effort dissolving into chaos. He needed 3 moves. First, to separate them, using their own momentum against them. Then to demonstrate his superiority without causing serious injury. Finally, to leave them with an understanding that would prevent future confrontations. The retired officer across the street had begun moving slowly along the building's edge, maintaining his coverage while gradually closing the distance. His presence added another variable to Morrison's calculations. The man's body language suggested law enforcement training. He could be an asset or a complication. King's patience was wearing thin. His next attack would come soon, driven by the need to reassert dominance after Marcus's defection. The remaining gang members were looking to him for cues, their own confidence shaken. Morrison kept his breathing steady, his muscles loose but ready. He'd positioned himself so that the streetlight cast his shadow against the wall, a psychological trick that made his movements harder to predict. The gang members would be focusing on his illuminated side, leaving them vulnerable to attacks from the shadows. The dumpster to his left would provide cover if needed, but more importantly, its position would force his attackers to cluster if they tried to flank him. The uneven pavement near the wall could be used to unbalance anyone charging in too quickly. Even the scattered pieces of trash could become obstacles or distractions. Everything was in place. Morrison had created a tactical environment where his superior training would appear almost supernatural to his untrained opponents. The lesson would be clear: some prey isn't prey at all. He felt the shift in the air as King's patience finally snapped. The gang leader's weight transferred to his front foot, the tell Morrison had been waiting for. In the next few seconds, these young men would learn why appearances can be deceiving and why some shadows are best left unexplored. Morrison allowed himself one final breath, his muscles coiling with controlled energy. The time for hiding was over. Now it was time to teach. King lunged forward with his knife, exactly as Morrison had predicted. The blade cut through empty air as Morrison shifted, not backwards as expected, but towards the attack. His movement was fluid, almost gentle, as he redirected King's momentum into the wall. The impact wasn't hard enough to injure, but the shock of it reverberated through the alley. What the? King's surprise was cut short as Morrison's hand clamped around his knife wrist, applying precise pressure to the radial nerve. The blade clattered to the ground, accompanied by King's startled gasp. The two bat-wielders attacked simultaneously, their weapons whistling through the air from opposite directions. Morrison dropped his center of gravity, pulling King down with him. The bats passed harmlessly overhead, and in their attacker's moment of overextension, Morrison moved. His first counter was almost invisible, a subtle shift of weight that sent one bat-wielder stumbling into the other. As they collided, Morrison released King with a gentle push that left the gang leader sprawled against the dumpster. Three opponents neutralized in less than 2 seconds, without a single punch thrown. The man with brass knuckles charged forward, throwing a wild haymaker. Morrison slipped the punch with minimal movement, allowing his attacker's fist to graze his jacket. The gang member's momentum carried him forward, straight into Morrison's carefully positioned foot. A controlled trip sent him rolling across the alley floor. "Stay down," Morrison spoke for the first time, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable command. "Nobody needs to get hurt here." King scrambled to his feet, face contorted with rage and humiliation. "Kill this guy!" he screamed, reaching for a second knife hidden in his boot. The other gang members hesitated, their confidence shaken by how easily their initial attack had been thwarted. Morrison moved through them like water through rocks, his actions precise and economical. When the bat-wielders came at him again, he simply wasn't there. Their weapons found empty air while his hands found pressure points and balance centers. One dropped his bat with a yelp as Morrison's fingers located a nerve cluster in his shoulder. The other's weapon was gently removed from his grip and sent skittering across the pavement. The man with brass knuckles tried to circle behind Morrison, looking for an opening. Instead, he found himself suddenly airborne, his own charge converted into a smooth throw that left him dazed but unhurt on the ground. Morrison had carefully controlled the fall, ensuring his opponent landed on the softest available surface. King's second knife slashed through the space Morrison had occupied a heartbeat before. The gang leader's attacks were becoming desperate, wild. Morrison allowed one swing to come close enough for King to feel confident, before stepping inside his guard. Their eyes met for a brief moment, then Morrison moved. The sequence that followed seemed impossible to the watching gang members. King's arm was suddenly pointing the wrong direction, his knife hand trapped in a hold that sent waves of pain through his shoulder without causing actual damage. He found himself kneeling, arm locked, completely immobilized by touches that had seemed no harder than a handshake. "That's enough," Morrison said softly, maintaining the hold with one hand while scanning the alley for other threats. The remaining gang members backed away, their earlier bravado replaced by wide-eyed shock. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds. None of the gang members had landed a single solid hit. More importantly, none of them were seriously injured, though their pride had taken a devastating blow. What are you?" one of the bat-wielders whispered, helping his dazed companion to his feet. Morrison didn't answer immediately. He adjusted his grip on King, ensuring the hold remained secure, but not damaging. The gang leader's face was pressed against the cold pavement, his second knife lying just out of reach. "Someone who's trying to avoid violence," Morrison finally replied. "Someone who's given you every chance to walk away." Across the street, Mr. Chen had maintained his position, ready to intervene if necessary, but his posture had relaxed slightly, professional recognition showing in his eyes. He'd seen enough to know that Morrison had the situation well in hand. Marcus, still standing at the alley's entrance, watched with a mixture of awe and relief. The homeless man's movements had confirmed his earlier suspicions. This was no ordinary street dweller, but a trained fighter who had chosen to show mercy. King struggled briefly in the hold, then went still as Morrison applied subtle pressure. "Your choice now," Morrison told him quietly. "We can end this here, with everyone walking away, or we can continue until you can't walk at all." "I'd prefer the first option." The other gang members looked to their leader, waiting for his decision. The alley had grown very quiet, the only sound being King's ragged breathing and the distant wail of a siren. Morrison maintained his position, patient and controlled. He demonstrated his superiority without causing lasting harm. The first part of his strategy complete. Now came the crucial moment. Would these young men learn from this encounter, or would pride force an escalation? King's body suddenly went rigid beneath Morrison's hold, not from pain, but from recognition. His next words came out in a whisper, heavy with disbelief. "Ghost 6, it's you, isn't it?" Morrison's grip tightened imperceptibly. That call sign hadn't been spoken aloud in 3 years. It belonged to a past he'd buried beneath layers of careful anonymity. "I was there," King continued, his voice trembling. "Kosovo, 2nd Battalion support. I saw your team go in that night. I was on perimeter watch when everything went wrong." The alley seemed to grow colder. Morrison's carefully constructed facade cracked slightly, memories flooding back with devastating clarity. The explosion, the radio chatter, the screams. "Private Thomas Reynolds," King said, no longer struggling. "That was my name back then, before everything fell apart." Morrison's tactical mind raced, reconstructing that night through this new lens. There had been support units positioned around the compound, young soldiers who'd witnessed the ambush, but were ordered to maintain position. He remembered passing them on his way in, their faces young and eager. "We were told to hold position," King's voice cracked, "to maintain radio silence no matter what we heard. They made us listen as your team, as everyone." The remaining gang members exchanged confused looks, not understanding the sudden shift in their leader's demeanor. But Marcus, still watching from the alley's entrance, saw the change in both men. The predatory tension had transformed into something more complex, more painful. "They said it was a training accident," King continued. "Told us to forget what we saw. But I couldn't. I knew we'd been ordered to let your team die. I tried reporting it up the chain, but..." Morrison remembered the aftermath, the official investigation that went nowhere, the convenient explanations, the silent warnings to anyone who asked too many questions. "I couldn't stay in after that," King said. "Took my discharge and tried to forget. But the guilt, it eats at you, doesn't it? Knowing you could have done something but followed orders instead?" Mr. Chen had moved closer, his law enforcement instincts telling him something significant was unfolding. He watched as Morrison's hold on King shifted from restraint to something almost supportive. "The streets were easier," King admitted. "Out here, power is simple. Violence makes sense. I could pretend that night never happened, that I was never that powerless kid watching good men die." Morrison finally spoke, his voice low and controlled. "You were following orders." "That's what they kept telling us," King laughed bitterly. "But you know what haunts me? The radio was open. We heard everything. Your team calling for support that never came. Your voice ordering them to hold position, to trust that backup was coming." The memory hit Morrison like a physical blow. He'd maintained radio discipline until the end, assuring his dying team that help was on the way. He'd given them hope, not knowing that help had been deliberately withheld. "I recognized your moves," King said quietly. "The way you control space, how you redirect instead of blocking. They showed us videos of your team during training. Said you were the standard we should aspire to. And now here you are, in my alley, looking like someone who's also trying to forget," Morrison finished. The other gang members had backed away, sensing they were witnessing something beyond their understanding. Marcus, however, moved closer, drawn by the raw honesty of the moment. "What do we do now?" King asked, no longer a gang leader, but a haunted young soldier seeking guidance from his former hero. Morrison's response was interrupted by a subtle movement at the alley's entrance. A figure in tactical gear melted out of the shadows, followed by another. Their movements were professional, practiced, and familiar. Well," a new voice called out. It seems our ghost has finally shown himself. Morrison's muscles tensed as he recognized the voice. It belonged to someone who should have died that night in Kosovo. Someone who had answers to questions he'd carried for 3 years. The night's simple confrontation had just become something far more complicated. Morrison released King from the hold, both men instinctively moving to face the new threat. In that moment, their shared past created an unexpected alliance. The homeless veteran and the gang leader, united by a truth they'd both tried to escape. Sometimes, Morrison said quietly, running from our past only leads us back to it. His eyes met King's, conveying an understanding that transcended their earlier conflict. The real question is what we do when it catches up. King nodded, straightening his posture in a way that echoed his military training. The other gang members, sensing the shift in their leader, followed suit. Marcus stepped forward to stand beside them, no longer caught between worlds but choosing his side deliberately. Across the street, Mr. Chen maintained his position, his experienced eyes reading the tactical situation. He'd seen enough to know that this night would change his neighborhood. For better or worse remained to be seen. The streets taught me to survive, King admitted, his voice carrying new purpose. But maybe it's time to remember what I was trained to protect. Morrison allowed himself a slight smile. There are better ways to use our skills than intimidating the helpless. Ways to make a real difference. The figures at the alley's entrance moved closer, their intentions still unclear. But they faced a different scenario now. Not a homeless man and a gang, but a unified group led by 2 trained warriors who'd finally stopped running from their past. Ready to remember who you really are, soldier? Morrison asked. King's response was immediate and firm. Yes, sir. Sometimes redemption comes in unexpected moments. Sometimes the very circumstances we try to escape become the catalyst for change. For Morrison, King, and the others in that alley, this night marked not an ending, but a new beginning. Sometimes the very things we run from become the path to our redemption. Morrison's journey teaches us that our past experiences, no matter how painful, can become tools to help others. What would you do if you found yourself in his position? Would you continue hiding from your demons or face them head-on to create positive change? If this story resonated with you, click the video appearing on your screen right now to continue your journey of self-discovery through more powerful stories of transformation and redemption. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to join our community of warriors seeking purpose and meaning in life's greatest challenges. Remember, every hero's journey begins with a single choice. Make yours count.